Welcome to Stories After Midnight. Today we're going to be reading a submitted story by Jarrett called The Madness of Mallory Kaufmann. Thank you for listening. Thank you for choosing this story to listen to. Let's get started. Inhumane monsters are always ripped from the womb of human mothers. They come out all the same, screeching, crying, their foreheads wrinkled and scrunched up like an unironed shirt. The body of the monster may indeed be perfect and free of disease, yet an unwanted gene or altered chromosome may produce something wrong within. A malformation of the mind. Some monsters are cast outside the reaches of normalcy, and as such are excluded from well-meaning society. They suffer rejection from their peers who find them strange and unlikable, and often they have no clue why. Others are able to hide their malformation and shroud their lack of kindness and conscience with a kind of charm and charisma that lulls people into traps. They revel in the pain of others and the infliction of it. To someone who is aware of their lack of magnanimity, a crying woman at a funeral must seem ridiculous. One such example was Mallory Kaufmann. She came into the world wretched from her dying mother. This is something her father never forgave her for. She was an accused murderer from the moment she drew breath, and was treated as such. She looked like any other young woman, short, thin body with an innocent face and long, curly brown hair that stretched down to the middle of her back. She had a defined, bony jawline and eyes that could charm and turn a man to jelly. Yet, it would have been wise not to get sucked into those eyes, for they were a deception, like everything else about her. Perhaps in hindsight, her name makes a strange sort of sense, for Mallory is derived from the old French term Malheureux, meaning unfortunate or ill-fated. She was one such child born with a malformation of the mind, a monster. She tried desperately to suppress these urges, but there was no locking them up forever. Something fundamental inside her brain was off-kilter. Her moral compass never pointed due north, her internal wiring always astray. Certain behaviors, or lack of them, molded her and sunk her into unimaginable depths of cruelty. The one thing Mallory was able to do was make certain folks uneasy. Some saw the unrestrained side of her, and if they did, it wasn't a pretty sight to behold. As a young girl, she bothered many of her classmates with her strange and erratic behavior. Perhaps it was the way she would fiddle and play with the corpses of dead birds on the playground, or the way she smiled as she stomped on a worm and spread its guts under her shoe. Beloved neighborhood pets would go missing and be found mutilated, their guts strung out in trees like grotesque Christmas lights, all around the Kaufmann residence. No one suspected Mallory, of course. Suspicion was laid at the feet of her stepbrother for a while, but when no evidence came to light, the talk died down. Eventually, however, as the children got older, entire swaths of boys and girls avoided Mallory like she carried some kind of infection. Her teachers would look at her, look away, and then look back at her, as if troubled by something they couldn't place. Mallory was always a perceptive person, and if she had an inkling that someone was scrutinizing her, she would don a wide, happy smile and act as the other children would in a vain attempt to fit in. She moved modestly and with little noise and spoke only when necessary. She treated words as if she had to pay out of pocket for each one. This was due to the fact that her father and stepmother would whip her if she spoke without being posed a question first. As such, she suffered severe mental estrangement from her family. Casual conversation was not to be found at the Kaufmann household, except for the rare occasion that a neighbor or family member dropped by. In that instance, all attempts would be made to appear normal and unassuming, with the visitor left scratching their head as to why the family seemed so off-putting. Mallory was a compulsive liar from the time she could socialize, and became quite good at it. The silence she was subjected to at home worked to Mallory's advantage, as she was able to daydream and concoct tales in her mind, weaving them with the truth. She wasn't innocent in her lying either, never telling a so-called white lie or harmless fabrication. No, for Mallory, her lying had a distinct purpose about it, and it was always at the expense of another, whether that be to escape punishment or responsibility. When she got older, she began lying to gain things as well, most notably another's time, trust, or money. Her mind was a web of conceived violence. When she wasn't cooking up her latest lie, she was planning ways on killing her family, particularly her stepmother. She loathed the woman and everything she stood for. She hated her father as well, but the current didn't flow as strongly. She imagined taking a knife from the kitchen and shoving it deep into her mother's skull. She would stand back and watch the blood billow out of her, spraying like those fancy fountains you'd see on a postcard. Then she would fall to her knees, her eyes a mask of confusion and bafflement. Perhaps she'd mouthed a why with her lips before dropping dead. This fantasy played out around Mallory's head until it formed a rough outline of a plan. From the time Mallory first dreamt it up, she knew she would eventually kill her stepmother. It would take years, she knew, but it was something that was demanded of her by some other being, a voice inside her head that cried out for bloodshed. She had to kill. The urge was inescapable. Despite her internal liberation, Mallory was controlled and dominated in all aspects of her home life. She lived with her father, stepmother, and older brother on a big ranch in the middle of Montana. Her aforementioned stepmother was a thin, weathered woman named Ethel. She was a crass, no-nonsense type who would have never won any popularity contests. Her tongue was as sharp as a knife edge. She wore a crucifix around her neck, yet never attended Sunday Mass. She was thin, and her hands were gnarled and worked to the bone. She took pride in nothing, not her home nor her children, for neither was hers. She refused to work in the kitchen, saddling Mallory with the thankless chore. And it was indeed thankless. Men who are ranchers seldom notice the food they are eating, for hunger is so prevalent that all they care about is the discomfort easing away. Ethel dictated what Mallory did to the point of absurdity. Chores were to be done from the moment she awoke. On days she didn't have school, she attended to the animals, the chickens and the pigs. The men milked the cows. Afterward, she helped with the laundry, which in the early 1900s consisted of washing the clothes by hand in a tub of soapy water, and then hanging them up on a line to dry. Afterwards, Mallory would bake in the kitchen, while Ethel sat in the reading room, and either used the room for its intended purpose or sewed clothes. She stitched together work shirts and patched up pants for Joe, her husband, or Albert, her stepson. Yet Ethel's fingers never made anything for Mallory. After baking, Mallory was to go outside and collect firewood off in the sparse clearing of trees that aligned the backyard of the ranch house. Then, she was to cook dinner, eat hastily, and wash all of the dishes by hand while the rest of her family lounged around. Only after this was Mallory free to go to her room, a dingy, windowless, closet-like space that only had room for a twin-sized bed and a dresser by the foot of it. The room was so constrained that only a mere single kerosene lamp lit it, for there wasn't a need for more. This would be a grueling, arduous day for anyone. Yet, for years, this is what her life was. The very essence of her existence, from sunup to sundown, was working or studying. If she forgot to finish a chore, or if they weren't completed with a sense of urgency, then Ethel would discipline her in the form of a spanking. While this may seem like an antiquated punishment, Ethel was ruthless, often using a paddle or whip until the flesh became red-hot and angry. Mallory was then instructed to sit on a hard wooden chair with her skirt lifted and undergarments pulled down around her ankles. This proved to be quite painful, and to add to the discomfort, Ethel would tie Mallory's feet to the legs of the chair to prevent her from moving or shifting her weight. Early in the summer of 1907 was when Mallory snapped. Ethel was outside, rolling clothes over the washboard, when she heard a peculiar sound from somewhere behind her. The warm wind rustled her graying hair as she straightened to better orient her ears. She stood up from her kneeling position and began to walk in the direction of the sound. Each step trampled the green grass and left distinct footprints as Ethel rounded the side of the wooden house. The sound became more noticeable, a soft, muffled moan. Ethel's ears perked up. Yes, it sounded like someone, or something, most likely an animal. Was one of the farm animals sick? She was too far away to tell. With a sense of urgency, Ethel picked up her pace, trekking to the back of the house. The closer she got, she realized that the sound was not from an animal, but rather a person. And when she rounded the corner, she saw a shadow flowing outwards from beyond the trunk of a tree. Ethel hurried over across the backyard, seeing a form huddled underneath the leafy canopy. There she saw her 20-year-old stepdaughter, her head thrown back, her eyes closed, her skirt bunched up ever so slightly to hide her hand. Mallory bit her upper lip as a tremulous, delighted exhale snuck past her lips. She was basking in ecstasy. "Oh dear God!" Ethel shrieked, a hoarse, high-pitched, dreadful vocalization that caused Mallory to jump. Grass rustled as she immediately rose to her feet, her eyes wide in surprise as she stared at her stepmother, then quickly looked down in shame. Ethel's mouth involuntarily contorted into a rictus, utterly repulsed by the creature standing before her. "No, it's not what you think." Mallory's eyes puddled as she put her hands up and backed away. Her stepmother continued to stare at her for a prolonged moment like someone looking at a pile of fresh vomit. Ethel's stunned expression gave way to a snarl. "Sinner!" She stormed over and slapped Mallory in the face. The impact stung like the wrath of 1,000 bees. Mallory gasped in shock, yet she grinned inwardly. This was just what she had been hoping for. It gave her courage for enacting her plan. It would be a step for her, albeit a massive one, but she was ready to take. "Please, no." Mallory's silky voice whispered as she clutched her reddening cheek. "You dirty little brat." Another sharp impact. This one a backhand to Mallory's right cheek. The knuckles were pointy and unpadded, leaving 4 red spots below her cheekbone. "No, I didn't do anything, I promise. I got a splinter while gathering wood, that's all, I swear," she said in that defensively sweet voice. Normally, a lie like this would be preposterous in the heat of summer. But the Kaufmann stove was a wood-burning type, so it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility. And sure enough, a pile of stumpy logs lay next to the tree. Ethel glanced at them and then back at her stepdaughter, unconvinced. "You stand there and lie. I heard you moaning. Because it hurt. Here, I'll show you." Mallory lifted up her dress to display, and sure enough, a rounded red mark on the inside of her left thigh. Ethel gasped and slapped Mallory twice more, these ones hard enough to make her dizzy and wobbly. She wasn't buying it. This took Mallory by surprise. She had worked this scenario out in her head the entire day and had anticipated, even expected the initial slaps, but not any after showing Ethel the mark on her leg. "How dare you expose yourself to me? You will burn in hell for this, you wench! You vile, awful, wicked!" Ethel ran out of breath before she did words. Her hands fell to her knees and she bent over as she expelled her anger with heavy panting. Mallory's hands flew to her face, covering it like a mask. Whilst feigning sobs, she glanced between her fingers and noticed with satisfaction how quickly the old hag tired. 4 slaps is all it took. Yet Mallory's appearance told a different tale, one of fear, of submission, of contrition. As she quivered in her hands, Mallory was finalizing her plan, and she would enact it that very night. She was tired of waiting. The deep-seated malice within her was finally going to release itself. After taking another explosive tongue-lashing from Ethel, Mallory was pulled by the earlobe back over to the house. They passed the pond to the right with a various array of pekin ducks gliding over the still water. The pond was a natural feature of the land and formed a jagged circle in the Kaufmann's side yard. Despite its small circumference, the pond was deep and a rich, serene blue. It acted as a well for the family with its year-long supply of fresh water. In the wintertime, another one of Mallory's chores was to break up the ice and scoop out buckets of drinking and bathing water. She glanced over to it as Ethel continued to tug at her ear, her skin stretching like a rubber band. "Ow! You're hurting me!" Mallory whined. She felt Ethel's fingers tighten their grip and pull harder. "You'll be begging for this after I'm done with you." Ethel spat in her ear as they ascended the steps of the front porch. She sat down in one of the wooden chairs and slapped the top of her thighs. "This'll be the worst one you've ever gotten, Missy." Ethel's teeth bared at her. Mallory knew the drill but didn't want to give in too quickly. "Over my knee, you harlot." "No," Mallory said, folding her arms defiantly across her chest. "What did you just say to me?" Ethel looked shocked. "I said no." Mallory wasn't sure why she felt so emboldened. "Well," Ethel huffed and rose from the chair. "We'll just see about that." She went into the house and returned a moment later. She held something in her hand, a potato peeler. Mallory felt her heart quail. Genuine fear consumed her. "What? No, Mother, not that!" She pulled back as Ethel reached out and grabbed her wrist. She yanked and pulled Mallory over her lap. Mallory squirmed and kicked and bucked. "Hold still, you harlot. Take your punishment with dignity for once in your wicked life." She felt her skirt lift, and then the chill of cold metal. She braced herself, biting the sleeve of her dress in anticipation. She wasn't going to peel off her skin, was she? Mallory laid there, waiting. Finally, she turned her head and looked up. Ethel looked unsure of herself. "Stand up and turn around." Mallory happily abided. She heard the clang of metal dropping on the porch. Relief flooded her. "Don't think you're getting off that easily." Now Ethel began to whip Mallory, as she had done so many times in the past. It was indeed the worst Mallory had ever gotten, yet not a tear was shed. She was too relieved to care, giddy in fact. She hardly felt the pain, but kept up appearances by crying out and begging for a reprieve that never came. Yet it planted the seed of doubt in Ethel's mind and perhaps a tinge of guilt. As the afternoon wore on, Mallory began her evening routine of cooking. On this particular night, a nondescript stew was on the menu, and she began roasting the meat and veggies in a large pot until the broth began to simmer. Her backside was tender and the pain made her wince and bite her lip. The initial excitement from her scheming had tapered off, leaving her sore and unable to stand up completely straight. Joe and Albert came in from working the fields, hot and sweaty, their clothes thoroughly soaked. Albert went to go take a bath in the washroom while Joe leaned against the kitchen table. He was too dirty to sit. "What you got in that pot?" he asked in his heavy drawl. Mallory turned to face her father. "Stew?" "I know, Dad. What, you think you're clever or something?" He spit his wad of tobacco out the prop door. Mallory shook her head fiercely. "No, of course not." "Good. A girl always ought to know her place." His eyes looked her up and down. He licked his lips hungrily. He had a certain kind of glint in his eyes that said he wanted her. His own daughter. And why not? It wouldn't be the first time he did something like that. Mallory killed his wife when she was born, so in his mind, the wife needed replacing. And not Ethel, that frail woman he married. She was just for show and to have another helping hand on the ranch. No, Joe needed someone younger. She had to be spry and beautiful, and Mallory checked all of his boxes. It didn't matter to Joe how abhorrent the act was. He was a man that took what he wanted. It's doubtful Joe ever gave the matter a second thought. "What kind of stew?" he asked. "It's beef," she said. He grumbled and gave a curt nod. She followed up. "Did you want me to?" "Don't give me no damn lip, you hear?" "Okay," she said, slinking back to the pot. "Sorry, sir." She didn't want him angry. She needed him to leave, and had to be left unsupervised to kick her plan off. She saw her brother Albert exit the washroom and walk upstairs to his room. Perfect. "Good. About time you learned some damn respect. This is my house, you got that?" he asked, pushing himself off the table. She turned, saw his aggressive posture, and smiled meekly. "Yes, sir." "Good. You give me any more lip and I'll hit you." He clenched his fist, then quickly relaxed it. She got the message. She got the message as he walked off. Mallory gave an internal fist pump as he stopped in the hall, fiddled in his shirt pocket, pulled out a cigarette and disappeared out the back door and into the backyard. The kitchen was squared, and if one was to travel a short distance down the hall, they would turn left to enter the washroom. That's where she needed to go. Then she realized Albert was already in there bathing. Had to improvise. She let out a short yelp, loud enough to be heard in the washroom. She hurried down the hall and poked her head in, a pained expression scrawled across her face. "I burned myself," she told him. He jolted up, the loofah encased in a thick, soapy lather. The shocked look on his face gave way to anger. "Why are you in here?" He shouted and squirmed in the tub. Water billowed over the sides and splashed down on the floor like waves on a rough sea. Mallory averted her eyes and held up her hand. "I burned myself on the stove. I just need some ointment." She sniffed once, giving a faint hitch to her voice. Turning away from him, she opened the medicine cabinet mounted on the wall and peered inside. A straight razor with shaving cream, shampoo, extra bars of soap, cotton balls, Epsom salts, castor oil. As Mallory read everything her family kept in the cabinet, panic began to creep through her skull. Oh no. Where was it? It was here. It had to be. Where? She began shuffling things around until... Yes. She clutched the small brown bottle in her hand, grinning widely as she read the label. Laudanum. She flipped it around. On the back, a warning. Don't ingest in large quantities. Can be fatal if ingesting more than 1 or 2 drops. "You put on weight?" She heard a voice from behind call. Rage flooded her. The world turned a dark crimson hue. She was ready to turn around and rip his eyes out of his head. Her hand tightened around the glass bottle, her knuckles whitening in a death grip. The snarl that immediately formed across her face faded to a smile as she realized he could see her reflection in the mirror. "No, silly. What are you talking about?" she said cheerfully. She felt like a clown performing for a child. You have, he said. You look like the cows I milked earlier today. That did it. All pretense of kindness immediately died. She spun around and stomped over to Albert, still naked in the tub. An enraged snarl was splayed across her face. He had never seen the real Mallory before, and now it terrified him. She reared her hand back and slapped him upside the head, the way a parent would a defiant child. Ow! What the? She slapped him again. She envisioned herself slapping Ethel the same way, and she felt her frustrations on the woman getting taken out on Albert. She leaned in close to his face and hissed through clenched teeth. You ever comment on my weight again, you so much as look at me, I'll kill you. Her voice was cold, menacing. I was only joking, he said, his hands raised. I know you were. You better be, she said. His eyes drifted to her hand. Is that burn ointment? He sputtered, pointing a shaky finger at the brown bottle. He was desperate to shift the topic. A painkiller. I'm mixing it with my water. He nodded and looked away. She straightened and slipped the small bottle in her bra and quietly walked out of the washroom, leaving Albert speechless. She began to grin widely. It evaporated as she saw Ethel sitting at the dining table. When did she come in? Her head was buried in her hands, each palm glued to the side of her head. She looked up as Mallory approached. An exasperated sigh spilled past her lips as she straightened in her seat. What's going on in there? What's all that hollering about? She asked. Mallory wet her lips. I burned my finger on the stove and I needed some ointment. Albert was bathing, she said. You couldn't wait? It was beginning to blister. Perhaps you should be more careful, Ethel lilted. She turned in her seat to face Mallory. By the way, I want you to know I'm sorry, she said. Mallory froze. What? Why are you apologizing? For earlier. Sometimes I wonder if I'm too hard on you. I frightened you because I was angry and that was wrong. Ethel smiled ruefully. Mallory frowned yet was doing a victory dance inside. If only the old hag knew how she was plotting her demise. She walked towards her stepmother and put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Oh, well, don't say that. No, I mean it. Why don't you go back to making dinner? You don't want your pot to boil over, Ethel said. Mallory gave a warm smile and turned back to the stove. Ethel pushed up from the table and said, I'm going to read. Mallory heard the feet of the chair slide back and then slide forward. Footsteps traveled down the hall and grew fainter as they ascended the stairs. Mallory glanced back over her shoulder. The kitchen was empty. She turned back with a malicious grin. Quickly, she pulled the laudanum out from her bra, unscrewed the cap and attached the dropper, and dumped half the bottle into the stew. The smell was bitter, but was quickly devoured by the smell of meat and vegetables. The resinous brown liquid mixed in with the dark broth. No one would know it was tampered with. A sadistic devil escaped from behind Mallory's eyes as nightfall approached, and the family sat around the table. She had set it with bowls and glasses full of ice water. Albert sat down and threw his hands up in the air at the sight of his empty bowl. Where's supper? I'm ravished, he squawked. All Albert knew how to do was gripe. His voice sounded like nails on a chalkboard to Mallory. Soon it wouldn't make a peep. With impatience staring her in the back, Mallory lifted the heavy metal pot with its boiling liquid and placed it down in the center of the table, onto the large trivet she had set. The thick, chunky stew bubbled and smoldered as Mallory lifted the ladle and spooned a heaping portion into everyone's bowls. About damn time, Joe drawled as he shoved a massive spoonful into his mouth. He winced, the broth still steaming. Mallory tensed. Joe worked his tongue a few times. His face soured and his brow lifted in surprise. She tensed further, her shoulders tightly wound in knots as he spit the stew back into his bowl. She heard Ethel's disgusted scoff to her left. Joe glowered across the table at her, and when he was satisfied his look had ended her coming objection, he looked at Mallory. What the hell'd you put in this? He asked her. Damn, he could taste it. Was it that obvious? She hadn't anticipated this. Before Mallory could stammer a reply, Ethel responded with, I don't taste anything off, she said. Tastes just like it always does, just burning hot is all. Mallory relaxed as she leaned forward in her seat and spooned a tiny amount of broth into her mouth. She pretended to swallow, yet kept the liquid puddled up along her bottom gum line. It burned her mouth and something awful, but she managed to keep it in. She felt her eyes water reflexively but held it back. Mallory found herself becoming impatient. She tapped her foot on the floor, drummed her fingers on the table, and glanced back and forth. looking for a sign that someone was feeling off. Nothing. But what was wrong? Had she not put enough in? She stared down at her bowl and swirled a chunk of potato around her spoon. Just then she heard Albert cough across from her and she looked up at him. He balled a fist and hacked into it. Ethel glanced over to her stepson, concern clouding her features. "What's wrong, Albert?" she asked. The boy could not answer. He was enveloped in a coughing fit so fierce Mallory could see his shirt suck inwardly, showing the sleek outline of his tortured ribs. "Son?" Joe asked. "Albert?" Ethel placed her hands on the table, her elbows cocked, ready to jump up out of her seat. Mallory looked around and, with everyone's attention diverted, discreetly spit the broth she had been holding back into her bowl. Albert began to claw at his neck and tried to mouth something. He sputtered instead as foam began to bubble at the corner of his lips like a rabid dog. "Oh my God, he's choking!" Mallory wailed and rose from her seat. She pushed past Ethel and cradled Albert's head in her hand. She lowered him to the floor as he began to shake and convulse, slamming the back of his head into the hard wooden floor like an epileptic having a seizure. She placed her hand under him so he impacted her palm instead. "Jesus! God!" Ethel shrieked as she squatted down next to Mallory. The two women tried to keep Albert's thrashing contained, but his muscle contractions were too violent to be controlled. Just then, Mallory heard gurgling from above her. She looked up and saw Joe grasping at his throat. He pointed an accusatory finger at her and said, "You!" It was a raspy, dying sound. Joe Kaufmann fell out of his chair and began convulsing next to his son. "Joe!" Ethel cried. Mallory stood up now, her two main threats neutralized on the floor. She donned a massive, toothy smile that pushed her cheekbones up towards her eyes. It was abnormally wide, and was perhaps the only time Mallory Kaufmann felt any kind of joy. "Don't just stand there! Come help here!" Ethel looked up at Mallory. She paused and saw the delight in Mallory's eyes. Her face looked inhuman, like a mask you'd wear to frighten someone. Terror suffused Ethel like a demonic claw retching at her chest. "What did you do?" she asked. Her expression was haunted, as if coming to a sick realization. Her jaw went slack as her features contorted into a murky, puddled-up sob. Mallory continued to grin. She tucked her chin down in her chest and flashed her teeth. "I did something naughty." Mallory rose, her palm to her mouth, giggling into it like a little girl up to something mischievous. She bathed in the delicious horror that played out about Ethel's face, the utter bewilderment, the crashing down of someone's entire world. Mallory could do nothing but smile. "What did you do?" The scream that tore past Ethel's throat was ear-piercing, yet Mallory barely heard it. She stepped back into the reading room and grabbed the pillow from the rocking chair. She went back into the kitchen, the grin still splayed across her lips, and held the pillow out to her stepmother. "Here, I got this for you. You're going to sleep for a long time now." Ethel looked behind her, seeing Albert's and Joe's still forms. Their thrashing had ceased, their faces veiny and purple, their eyes glazed over. She looked back at her stepmother and put a shaking hand on the kitchen table. She managed to get up to her knees but no further. She stared up at Mallory, the veins in her neck and lower face pulsating and becoming a sickly shade of purple. "May God strike you dead!" The words held conviction but no muster. Mallory only giggled again and skipped over to the half-empty pot of scalding stew. She lifted it up by the handles, holding it chest high, and walked back over to Ethel. "I was going to use a knife on you. I've been wanting to since I was a little girl, but now I have something better." "What? What are you going to do, kill your own mother?" she shouted. Mallory's grin expanded to as wide as her face would allow. She felt the strands of muscles pulled to their tensile limit. "Why not? I already did once." The tone was jubilant, but laced with menace. Mallory dipped the pot downwards, felt the steam rise into her face and moisten her cheeks. The boiling liquid tumbled downwards in one long stream. Ethel looked up in terror at the cascading deluge. She felt the heat from the pot radiate down towards her, saw the trails of white steam rise up and evaporate on the low ceiling. She saw the liquid flow past the lip of the pot, saw Mallory's divine pleasure. The broth flowed downwards like a brown river. She tried to move her head or duck out of the way, but the poison made her movements languid. Too late. She tried to push herself back onto the floor. She felt the first drop as soon as it made contact with the top of her scalp. The agony immediately blazed through her skull. She felt individual strands of hair melt and fuse together, then another drop, then another, and then a torrential downpour of excruciating torture as the stream of boiling hot broth coated Ethel's head and shoulders in a burning cloak. She heard her flesh sizzle like it was being cooked, felt a hive of a million bees, wasps, and hornets sting her all at once. She felt every small burn she had ever received in her entire life, every hot pan she touched with a finger, every knuckle burnt on an oven rack, and it was magnified 100-fold. It felt like someone was holding her head down on top of a raging stove burner. She felt the stew trickle down into her eyes and ears. She closed her eyes, but the broth ate through her eyelids and scorched her retinas. It melted the fabric of her shirt, fusing it with her skin. What skin was exposed began to melt and peel away like wax from a lit candle. She heard herself scream. It was all she heard, for the agony was so enveloping and complete in its misery that no other sound filtered through. She began to spasm on the floor as she began to immolate. She screamed until her vocal cords ran dry, bucked and kicked as Mallory continued to pour. As Ethel drew her last agonized breath, terror flooded her eyes. Mallory stood over her, that maniacal grin still plastered on her face, waiting until every last drop was expelled from the pot. Mallory gloated until Ethel stopped moving. Her body smoldered like the remnants of a campfire. She took a step backwards and took in the carnage. Joe, Albert, and Ethel, the shackles on her life, all dead. She dropped the pot and twirled gleefully in a circle. She had no worry about the police or witnesses. The nearest neighbors were too far away to have seen anything or heard any commotion. She had to hide the bodies. She walked down the short hallway and exited the back door of the house and into the backyard where the barn was nestled. She pushed through the doors and went over to the cows, where massive blocks of salt licks lay stacked. She heaved one, found it too heavy to lift, so let it drop onto the hay-covered dirt with a thud. She pushed it end over end until she reached the duck pond. She did this twice more, one for each body. The rope she tied around each block was heavy and well used, and she created another loop on the end where she ensnared a pair of feet. First Albert, with him being the lightest. Then she tied his corpse to the salt lick and pushed the block into the water. She was uncertain that he would sink, yet he flew to the bottom like the anchor on a boat. Bubbles floated to the surface of the pond and burst in the pale white moonlight. She did the same with Joe and Ethel, dragged their bodies out of the house and across the backyard, tied their ankles to a salt lick, and pushed them into their watery graves. All was still again. The woods surrounding her drew silent. She got down on her knees, removed her dress and undergarments until there was nothing left to shed, and slid into the pond where her family lay entombed. She began to swim, leisurely and relaxing. The water was cool against her flesh, and she felt a profound liberation overcome her. After several moments, she stopped and dunked her head under the water and stared down at the dark abyss. She saw nothing but blackness. She focused her gaze and spotted the faint outline of 3 still forms. Streams of bubbles shot up to the surface as she laughed. Breaking the surface, she drew a long, happy breath and threw back her head. Mallory Kaufmann floated in place and guffawed at the stars. That's the end of the story. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for listening. If you did enjoy it, let me know in the comments below if you can, wherever you're listening from, or like the video, episode. I'm not sure what you got available, but if you'd like to support the channel even more, there is a Patreon available that does have early access and other little goodies that I've uploaded. If you'd like to come chat with the community, there is a Discord available. We'd love to see you there. Come say hi, hang out a bit, chat with us. And with all that said, thank you once again for coming. Huge shout out to my patrons for making this episode possible. If you are one, thank you. And with that, we will see you in the next one.